Hello and welcome to this special discussion that the Wire is bringing you on the former National Security Advisor and former Foreign Secretary of India, Shivshankar Menon's new book, Choices. It's quite rare for a former Indian Foreign Secretary, or indeed for a former Indian policymaker at the highest level, to write about issues that he or she dealt with during the time that they were public officials. And it's even perhaps more rare that this kind of writing takes place in such a lucid fashion. Shivshankar Menon, thank you very much for joining us for this
Thanks for
chat.
having me.
Choices inside the making of India's foreign policy. The title suggests that this would be a kind of soup to nuts, full account of Indian foreign policy. You have wisely chosen to avoid writing the definitive book on Indian foreign policy from 1947 to the present.
I wouldn't dare.
But you've instead chosen a more conservative approach, I would say a practical approach, where you have drilled deep into a limited number of questions, 5 in particular, that you dealt with in one way or the other during your time as a Foreign Service officer, and of course as Foreign Secretary and as NSA. And you have, in a sense, analyze each of these situations from the point of view of the kind of choices that India was confronted with and the wisdom or otherwise of the choices that it made. India-China, you focused on the negotiation of the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement, but of course there are wider ruminations on India-China. You've looked at the Civil Nuclear Initiative with the US. You looked at India-Pakistan relations, in particular the dilemma of how to respond to continuing acts of cross-border terrorism. You looked at the India-Sri Lanka relationship, and in particular the violent or very violent endgame where the LTT was finally militarily defeated by the Sri Lankan army. And finally, an issue on dealing with nuclear weapons, which is India's no first use policy and the rationale for that. And I would like to, within the time that we have, try to go to a greater or lesser extent on each of these topics, but obviously we won't have time for the full Monty. But let me start with the fundamental premise of your book, which is that you chose to write only on issues which you had first-hand knowledge of. And the one topic where, at least going by the public record, most of the major decisions were taken before you were in NSA, for example, which is the Indian policy of no first use. That we will not be the first to ever use nuclear weapons. And of course, there is a nuclear doctrine, which was first drafted by the National Security Advisory Board shortly after India became a declared nuclear weapon state. I think in 1999 it was drafted, and then it was officially adopted with some modifications when Brajesh Mishra was NSA in 2003. Now, I'm sure that as NSA, you would have dealt with questions, clarifications, challenges, perhaps even disquiet among different levels of Indian stakeholders on why we have this policy. And I think that's perhaps why you've chosen to write it. It's brilliantly timed because as we speak, NFU has come back into the debate with the Raksha Mantri, Manohar Parrikar, in a way suggesting that perhaps this needs to be reviewed. Why are you such a strong advocate of no first use? Why do you think it's so central to India's position as a nuclear weapon state?
Well, I think I make the argument that every review so far, and it's been reviewed thrice since 2003, has shown that it actually serves India's interests.
What prompted these reviews?
And also, I think naturally, and I think it's normal. Actually, I don't say that it's cast in stone. In fact, what I argue for is that it's today the best policy, but that we need to keep reviewing it because developments around us will keep changing. And what we are dealing with here is a changing environment within which we make this decision. So it's a policy that, like all policies, needs to be adjusted to reality and to the circumstances in which you apply it. But so far, I think it's served our purposes because for us, nuclear weapons are not war-fighting weapons. The idea of nuclear weapons, or India having nuclear weapons, is in order to prevent nuclear coercion and blackmail. Other people using the threat of using nuclear weapons in order to limit our options, change our behavior. And I think that it has done successfully. If you look at the record, credible nuclear threats against India since 98 really haven't been there. Whereas before that, there were at least three on the public record, three instances when the threat of use of nuclear weapons against India was used. Fortunately,
would you care to elaborate telegraphically for the benefit of
fortunately,
viewers?
it never changed our actual behavior because we had strong leadership and strong-minded leadership.
Right.
1971, when the Enterprise came into during the Bangladesh War. Again in the early 90s, when there was tension on the line with Pakistan.
And you believe, like most analysts, that Pakistan already was...
you see, whether they had it or not, I think Pakistan has always exaggerated her capabilities and has always wanted you to believe that she has more. And normally she announces capabilities before she actually has them.
Right.
And that's been a repetitive pattern. But that is, whether can any leadership take the chance on calling that bluff, and do you want to? And for Pakistan, these are warfighting weapons. It's built into their doctrine. They actually exercise and practice the Pakistan military. Right. It's also the only nuclear weapons program which is entirely under military control in the world. I mean, it's the only one of its kind.
And Khalid Kidwai, the former strategic plans boss, has actually elaborated the specific conditions under which Pakistan would come to the first use.
And they have tried, I think, to use the weapons to try and lower the threshold for conventional war consistently. But it's important that we keep reviewing it, but so far I think it's actually served our purposes.
Right. If you're convinced that nuclear weapons are not a war-fighting instrument, under what circumstances, no first use envisages retaliation, but never initiating a nuclear conflict. Right? Because if it's not a war-fighting instrument, then you wouldn't want to ever think of using them. So under what changed circumstances, could you think of India moving away from NFU? Because what is pushing the debate right now is this idea that Pakistan has developed, and officially says so, tactical nuclear weapons.
See, in our situation, frankly, I don't see the distinction between tactical and nuclear. And what's the difference?
Because of geographic proximity.
This is not Cold War.
Right.
Because we're next to each other with 3-minute launch warnings.
Yeah.
What is tactical? Lahore is 40 kilometers from the border. Amritsar, huge population concentrations. These are not, and if you look at the effects of those nuclear weapons, the use of nuclear weapons anywhere along the line, it's going to be on both sides of the line. It's not going to respect borders and somehow say, because I'm an Indian weapon, it won't affect Indian lives and so on. So, for me, this distinction, frankly, is relatively meaningless. Any use of nuclear weapons in our situation is going to be devastating.
Regardless of scale.
Regardless of scale anyway for nuclear weapons is relatively large.
Right.
So I think you have to therefore, think of it slightly differently. Retaliation, for us, we've laid down quite clearly the conditions under which we would use them. And I think we've made that quite clear in the doctrine.
Right.
We are, in fact, one of the first countries to be so clear and one of the quickest off the mark in terms of declaring a doctrine, and we have so far matched that in terms of our posture, in terms of what we do.
Right. In your book, you talk about the impact of so-called cold start, or the noise of propaganda around cold start as being an important factor in Pakistan's own thinking. The modification of the doctrine that took place when it was officially declared had a few small but significant changes, one of which was an attack on Indian forces anywhere.
Correct.
And the presumption is that Indian forces outside of India's borders, because an attack on India would automatically trigger retaliation. Was that in some sense to alert any possible adversary that so-called smaller nukes or tactical nukes would invite the kind of catastrophic response that a regular quote-unquote nuclear attack would?
I think it's quite clear that no matter what the scale, any nuclear attack will be met with retaliation, and the retaliation will be big.
Right. So the critics then say that how credible is that? Because if you're trading an attack on a column that serves quote unquote a tactical purpose for Pakistan, say, with annihilation of an entire country, is that the kind of decision that an NSA could possibly make, or a prime minister or the head of the nuclear command authority?
I think it's a decision that the initiator of the first strike has to take, which means it's not the Indian prime minister's decision. Whoever actually takes the decision to launch that first strike would have already taken that decision. Now, to say is it credible or not, this is like saying, when did you stop beating your wife? you will only know it's not credible if deterrence fails. In which case, frankly, there's not going to be any winners or losers from a nuclear war.
Right.
There's only losers.
Right.
And so I don't think that's the right question. The question is, have you done everything possible to make that credible, that deterrence credible? And I think yes, we have.
Right.
Which is why we have a triad, which is why we do everything to make it survivable, and which is why I think the certainty of it has been consistently reiterated by every successive government, no matter what their political composition.